only thing we have to fear is
in war.
fear itself.
There is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
You found your way to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green. It's actually faith in the culture. We kind of say politics, culture, all those things interchangeably. It's every single area of the culture, though, not just politics. That's why often we have folks on talking about everything from being an influence in the media to journalism and entertainment, making movies, education, sports, all of those things. We need to be willing to recognize that Psalms 24:1 is right. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Therefore, it all belongs to Him. That means Hollywood belongs to Him. That means Washington, D.C., and everything in between. We just need to take God's principles in those arenas if we want to see them represented well there. So it's up to us to go be His hands and His feet, folks. So one of the areas we do that is in the area of government. And we're sort of in the middle of a program here by David Barton called Principles of Limited Government. Yesterday was the beginning of the presentation. If you missed yesterday, you can visit our website at wallbuilderslive.com or wallbuilders.com. Now, if you go to wallbuilderslive.com, click on the archive section, little button in the right-hand side of the page there. Click on archives. It'll pull up really pretty much the last year of programs, so you can enjoy a lot of our previous programs. Especially encourage you to watch, listen to the, it's kind of hard to watch a radio program, huh? Listen to those Friday programs. That's Good News Friday. It'll be very encouraging for you. We bring you great victories from across the nation in all kinds of areas of the culture. But for this particular presentation, you want to click on archives, and then you can download yesterday's program and today's program, and you'll be able to get caught up. Now, tomorrow will be the conclusion. So today we're going to get as much as we can, and tomorrow we'll get the conclusion. Let's pick up right where we left off yesterday. Here's David Barton on the principles of limited government.
The rights I've talked about, whether it be the life issues, the abortion issue, or religious expression, or the right to keep and bear arms, or marriage, or even private property, those are all issues that people say, well, those are social issues. I'm really concerned about economic issues. I'm really concerned about what the government does with spending, and I want someone in Congress or someone in the state legislature or someone in City Hall that's not going to take and spend all the money like crazy and get us in debt, and so they're concerned about economic issues. I don't like those abortion issues. That's a divisive issue. I don't care about it. I don't care about school prayer. I don't care about the other stuff. What I want is someone who's really sound on economic issues. You know, it's really interesting that when you look at those that are considered to be sound on economic issues, and by the way, there are a number of groups in Congress that monitor all sorts of votes, congressmen. So you, for example, on the life issue, groups like National Right to Life and other Right to Life groups will score all the votes of every congressman and senator and tell you, yeah, this guy really is right to life, or he's not very, or this one is absolutely not right to life. Well, you've got that on agricultural issues, you've got that on military issues, but if you want to take a look at economic issues, where a lot of people say they're very concerned, one of the scorecards that keeps track of economic issues is the Americans for Tax Reform. You take the Americans for Tax Reform and look at the people that they list, and they rank all the 435 members of the House, and you look at the 100 members in the Senate, they rank them all from the best on economic issues to the worst, from top to bottom. And so when you go down the list and you look at the representatives at the top, and you take that list, and if you will superimpose on it the Right to Life list, it's pretty interesting. You'll find that if someone, for example, is 100% as a good economic representative, they're also 100% as a right to life person. And conversely, when you take and look at the worst economic representatives in Congress, those that score a 0, they're willing to spend everybody else's money and take more money from everybody else, and they're willing to run us into debt, you'll find that they have a 0% voting record on tax issues and on economic issues. Strange thing, they also have a 0% voting record on right to life issues. You'll find that if you take the right to life voting record and put it side by side with the economic voting record, it's almost identically superimposed. what you find is when someone understands the limitations on government on social issues, they also understand the limitations on government on economic issues. Money does not belong to the government, it belongs to individuals. And to steal money from individuals through whatever government spending program is taking private property, and you're not supposed to do that. So there are those people who say, well, I'm not a social conservative, I'm an economic conservative. And yet when you check the economic records, usually they're not conservative. They usually are in the middle of the pack. They're not very good on social issues, and they're not very good on economic issues, despite what they say about themselves. So interestingly enough, when you take that first issue, the right to life issue, you can just about peg where that person is on every other issue. And that's why people in city council, they say, why are you asking me about abortion issues? There's nothing I can do about abortion. It's a city council thing. Talk to the Supreme Court. Talk to don't ask me about abortion. No, I ask you about abortion because that tells me where you are on every other issue. When I find out where you are, I know how much money you're going to be spending. I know what you're going to do with taxes. I know what you're going to do with debt in the city, or, as I mentioned, even a dog catcher. I know what you're going to do with spending in your dog catching department. It all goes back to the right to life. So the Founding Fathers were right about that, and statistically it bears out. And by the way, you can look at second groups as well, because not only is that economic record reflected in the Senate, you'll find that if you take groups beyond Americans for Tax Reform and take someone like the National Taxpayer Union or the National Taxpayer Union Foundation that also rank economic scores, it's the same thing. You bump up against right to life scores, and if you're good on the abortion issue, you're going to be good on the economic issues. If you're bad on the abortion issue, you're going to be bad on economic issues.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Today, numerous court decisions demonstrate that there's often a conflict between the courts, the law, and religion. Has this conflict always existed? Not according to James Wilson. James Wilson was a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was a law professor as well as an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. James Wilson saw no conflict between religion and the law. In fact, just the contrary. He declared, "Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends, and mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other." In the views of Founding Father James Wilson, religion and good civil law were inseparable.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
So American government, our whole philosophy that created American exceptionalism is there's a God. God gives inalienable rights to man, and government exists to secure those rights to man. That's the whole philosophy of government. That's what makes American exceptional. Now, you can say that's limited government because, again, limited government doesn't have anything to do with the size of the bureaucracy or the size of the spending. It has to do with the limitations on the jurisdiction of government. We're not going to let government be the parents. God raised up parents. We're not going to let government usurp the church. It's the church that's to take care of the poor. We're not going to let government become the individual everything. People are responsible for their behavior. So limited government is not the size of government, it's the scope and the intrusion of government. Now, probably one of the best presentations of the core principles of limited government, the core principles of good government, came from President Thomas Jefferson in his first inaugural address. Let me just quote to you what Jefferson said in that first inaugural address. And in this inaugural address, he gives 5 simple principles that help us know what it is that makes good government. Here's what he said. He said, "After acknowledging and adoring an overruling providence, what more is necessary to make us a happy and a prosperous people?" He said, "Still one thing more. A wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government." Now, in that short statement, that short little paragraph, he laid out 5 principles that lead to the nation's prosperity and happiness, and he said this is the sum of good government. So let me just take each of those 5 points and go through them, because again, it was Jefferson who was the principal author of the Declaration, who helped frame that philosophy that produced American exceptionalism. He certainly knows it and understands it, and so in his inaugural address as president, his first address, he sets forth those same principles of government. He said number one is, he says, acknowledge and adore God. He said after acknowledging and adoring overruling providence, so the first thing he starts with is you need to acknowledge and adore God. Now, in doing that, there's 2 verbs in that little statement. There is the acknowledgement of God. There's acknowledge God and there's adore God. Now let's take acknowledge God. George Washington really has some great statements on how important it is for a nation and for a people to acknowledge God. As a matter of fact, if you look at the very first federal Thanksgiving prayer proclamation issued by the federal government, it was under George Washington, 1789, October 1789. Here's the very first religious proclamation given by the federal government, and listen to the sentence that George Washington uses to start this. Why did George Washington do a religious proclamation? What was the purpose? He tells us right here. He said, it is the duty, and that's a pretty strong word. He said, it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Now, you're going to hear some verbs here. Listen to what Washington said it was the duty. He says, the duty of nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. He said, it's a duty to acknowledge God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and to implore His protection and favor. And that's the duty of whose duty is that? He said that is the duty of nations. Not just this is not something you do in private. This is something you do in public, because remaining God conscious reminds you that the rights come from God. If you lose that God consciousness, well, the government gave the right to life, so it can take it away. The government gave the right to property, it can take it away. The government can set my wages and tell me. If you lose the God consciousness, you lose the concept of limited government. So Jefferson begins with that. He says, acknowledge God. And by the way, when you look at the word acknowledge in America's first dictionary, a dictionary done by Noah Webster, founding father himself, Noah Webster's actually responsible for Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Here's what he said about acknowledge in the first dictionary. He says, acknowledge means to admit to be true. So we start out by saying, okay, I admit there's a God, I acknowledge that God, I know that it's true, and so from that I'm going to acknowledge Him, I'm going to obey Him, and you go through the verbs that George Washington used, but that's the first thing Jefferson says is acknowledge God. Now, within that same first sentence, he says acknowledge and adore God, and adore is the second verb that he uses there. So when you look at the word adore God, definition changes there. Noah Webster says adore means to love and to regard with the utmost regard and affection. Now, acknowledge means intellectually. All right, I believe there's a God. I admit there's a God. But adore means to make Him personal, to love and regard with the utmost regard and affection. Now you're personalizing the belief in God. It's just not simply saying, yeah, there's a God out there somewhere. You're saying, there's a God out there, and I love Him, and I recognize Him, and I believe Him to be personal. And by the way, Jefferson was really strong on that. As a matter of fact, his belief in a personal God, if you'll go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., you'll find inside the memorial there that there are 4 tableaus of stone that are engraved with famous Jefferson quotes, and around the ring of the inside of that dome is another quote, a 5th quote that you'll find there. And as you look at those 4 stone tableaus on the wall, those marble tableaus, and the engraved quote around the dome, out of the 5 quotes, you'll find that 4 of the 5 directly acknowledge God. Now, Jefferson, I admit to be one of the least religious founding fathers. We have a couple of founding fathers that weren't all that particularly religious compared to the others, but here's your least religious founding father, and 80% of his political rhetoric that we've selected as the best quotes of Jefferson are God-centered. Well, one of those tableaus of stone talks about the conviction that you have to have, love, and adore a personal God. Listen to what Jefferson said. He says, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we've removed their only firm basis? And here's the newsflash. Thomas Jefferson, our, quote, least religious founding father, he's going to tell us the only firm basis of national liberties. Again, he says, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we've removed their only firm basis, which is a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with His wrath. He said that the basis of national liberties is a conviction in the minds of the people that the liberties come from God, that you can't violate them but with His wrath. And he closed by saying, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that His justice cannot sleep forever. Very simply, hey, there's a God. God gives specific rights. If we violate those rights, we're going to get God angry at us. And man, am I scared for my country if God gets angry. See, that is acknowledging and adoring God. That is making the feelings personal, the love and the regard and the high esteem. And Jefferson said that's the starting place of government. And it is, because if you don't start with the acknowledgement of God, you'll never understand inalienable rights, you'll never protect those rights, and you'll never have limited government. So it has to start with acknowledging and adoring God.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Joseph Story is one of the most important names in American jurisprudence. Not only was he placed on the U.S. Supreme Court by President James Madison, but he also founded Harvard Law School and authored numerous legal works on the Constitution. While today's revisionists claim that the goal of the First Amendment was absolute religious pluralism, Justice Joseph Story vehemently disagreed. He declared, "The real object of the First Amendment was not to encourage, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but was to exclude all rivalry among Christian denominations." According to founder Joseph Story, Christianity, not pluralism, was the goal of the Founding Fathers in the First Amendment, for only a Christian nation is tolerant and thus is truly pluralistic.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
The second thing he said, what more is necessary? A frugal and wise government. Number two, you need to exercise frugality. Now, frugality, thriftiness, if you will, there were three areas where they pointed to where government needed to be frugal. The first was in power. You had to realize that government was a steward of delegated authority. Government didn't have power. Power came to it from the people. There's only one constitution in the world that is older than the U.S. Constitution, and that Constitution is the Massachusetts Constitution. Massachusetts Constitution, written largely by John Adams and Sam Adams and John Hancock, it was done in 1780. Now, the U.S. Constitution was done in 1787 and ratified in 1789. The Massachusetts Constitution is the original Constitution, 7 years older than the U.S. Constitution, is still in place today in Massachusetts. It's kind of unfortunate they don't read their own Constitution, because it did have much to say about judges and marriage, and the whole same-sex marriage thing came out of Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Constitution actually deals with what to do with the judges who did what was done there, but I guess nobody reads the Constitution. But nonetheless, it's the oldest Constitution. It is a successful document when used, when read, and the founders who wrote that helped with the U.S. Constitution, this is what they said. Great statement. All power residing originally in the people and being derived from the people, the magistrates and officers of government vested with authority, whether they are legislative, executive, or judicial, those officers are the people's substitutes and agents and are at all times accountable to them. They said, hey, principle of government is that all three branches are accountable to the people. Authority comes from the people. It does not come from government. The people give government certain authority, and government can only exercise the authority the people give it, and the people can discipline any of the three branches. All of those branches have to answer to the people. See, that is being a steward of power. You say, hey, the power doesn't belong to me. I may be president or senator or rep or whatever, but the power belongs to the people. I'm a steward of it. I can't take that power and abuse the people with it. James Wilson, we talked about James Wilson already. I love the way he summed it up. He said, here in America, the people are masters of government. Elsewhere, the government is master of the people. That was the difference. We believe that here the people were more important than the government, that the government was to serve the people. Elsewhere, they believed the people were to serve the government. If you lose that philosophy, if that gets away from you, you're no longer being frugal with the power of government. Now, the second frugality they talked about was that of spending. In other words, what you do with the money and the holdings that come into government. And there's a great quote by Benjamin Franklin, and you may recall that Benjamin Franklin was really good with pithy little statements, Poor Richard's Almanac and the pithy statements that he used there, little proverbs, if you will, just kind of a homespun wisdom. This is what he said: when you incline to have new clothes, look first well over the old clothes and see if you cannot shift with them another year, either by scouring or mending or even patching those clothes if necessary. He said, remember, a patch in your coat and money in your pocket is better and more credible than a writ on your back and no money to take it off. In other words, it's better to have some older clothes, maybe with a patch or two here and there, than it is to have something brand new, but you can't pay for it. You have a writ against you. You have a lien against you because you haven't been able to pay for it. Well, that's the way government's supposed to operate. Now, most of us, when we get in tight economic situations in our family, we'll keep the car an extra 2 or 3 years. We'll kind of hold off on doing extravagant things. Government should be doing that as well. But no matter what the debt is, no matter what the economic crisis is, they've always got brand new little cars that they need to pull into the fleet every year. And they're always building brand new buildings and adding wings and extensions, and they're not being frugal with money. And that axiom from Ben Franklin, that a patch on your coat, money in your pocket, is better and more credible than a writ on your back and no money to take it off. It's a good deal to have a savings account. The government evidently doesn't believe that, but that's not a good government that doesn't believe that it should be saving money, not spending money.
Hey friends, Rick Green here to tell you about a great new opportunity to learn about the Constitution and our Founding Fathers. One of our great Founding Fathers, John Jay, he was an author of the Federalist Papers, and he was actually our very first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He said that every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution. By knowing their rights, they'll sooner perceive when they're violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. Chief Justice Jay was exactly right, and never before have I seen so many people interested in doing exactly what he said. People all over America are wanting to read and study the Constitution. They want to know what the principles are that made our nation great. They are hungry to preserve our liberty, preserve our prosperity, and our limited government. They understand that American exceptionalism must purposefully be preserved for future generations. Well, we've done a program that now covers the entire Constitution. It's the Citizen Guide to our founding documents. We go through every clause, every article, every amendment. We get into the Founding Fathers. We talk about what they actually intended. We talk about what those words meant in 1787, not necessarily what they mean today, but what was the original intent. We cover subjects from whether or not a constitutional convention would be good, a new one, whether or not state nullification of a federal law is the right way to go. We talk about D.C. statehood, impeachment, the Electoral College, First Amendment freedom of religion, individual God-given rights versus group government-given rights, whether or not the Constitution is evolving and whether it should be the court or the people that would do that. All of these things, and it's right there in a class. And you can actually attend one of our live classes around the country by signing up at my website, rickgreen.com. Click on Constitutional Class. It'll list the cities where we're coming to, and if you'd like us to come to your city and we're not already headed that way, then shoot us an email and we'll try to get a class scheduled. You can also get the entire class on DVD and CD, so it's like you're in the room. You get to be a part of the questions and the answers. It's all right there on the DVD. Go to my website to find out more, rickgreen.com. So hope that you will dive in and study the Constitution. Let's do what Chief Justice John Jay suggested that we do. Let's read and study the Constitution, and here's your opportunity to do that. It's called the Citizen Guide to our Founding Documents.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
There's a great statement from Thomas Jefferson who said, "I place economy as the first and most important of Republican virtues, and public debt is the greatest of dangers to be feared." What's the first virtue for government? Is economy, frugality. And what's the greatest danger? Public debt, running up a debt. Now, when you run up a debt, the Bible then tells us very clearly that at that point, when you owe someone money, the borrower is servant to the lender. When you owe someone money, they get the say over what you can do with your items and goods, and they put a lien on you. Same thing with government. When government has a debt, someone owns that debt. And right now, of the debt that America has, the largest owner of American debt is the Chinese. That's a whole different culture and system and belief structure than what America has. But when the Chinese say, oh, we want these debts to be paid, by the way, we need some trade markets open, we need this kind of technology shared with us, we're in a position that we're no longer independent as we had been. Debt puts you under a type of servitude to those who own the debt. So that's why Jefferson said public debt is the greatest of dangers to be feared. Now, unfortunately, and you look at the federal government, over the last decade, the population has increased 10%. So with 10% more in the population, it would make sense that government spending would go up 10% as well, because there's more people, and 10% more people, 10% more spending. That's doing the same thing. But that's not what happened. Over the last decade, population's increased by 10%, but spending by the government has increased 50%. we're spending money 5 times more rapid than there is a need by the population to spend the money. When you look at earmarks, and earmarks have been a huge topic of debate over the last 15 to 20 years. You go back to 1996, we didn't believe that earmarks were a good thing in government. So out of thousands of bills that were introduced, out of the hundreds of bills that were passed, in 1996 there were 958 earmarks. Now that's still too many earmarks, but compared to where it was even a decade later, it was up to 16,000 earmarks, and that's an increase of 1,557%. And now, even after that point in time, earmarks have continued to expand and burgeon. And so what we're doing is we're taking money to pay for all these little pet projects. And congressmen come home and say, hey, I brought $43 million home to the district in earmarks. Well, if you think about that for a moment, no bill gets passed through Congress, through the House of Representatives, without 218 members of Congress voting for it. That's a majority of the House of Representatives. So if I'm going to have an earmark and I want to bring $15 million home to my district wherever, and I happen to live in Texas, my district of Texas, I've got to convince 217 other members of Congress to vote for that $15 million for my district. And they'll do that if I'll vote for their projects as well. So what happens is, for every dollar that I bring home, I've had to agree to spend money for 217 other folks in their districts. In other words, for every dollar I get as a congressman, I've spent $217 to get that dollar. That's the problem with earmarks. Oh, look what he brought home to the district. No. Look how much he spent to get this money home to the district. When you're outspending yourself 217 to 1, that's not good economics. And that's why earmarks and debt and other things have become such a focus in recent years. That's a loss of limited government.
Out of time for today, folks. That was David Barton on the principles of limited government, actually part 2 of a 3-part series. So if you tuned in halfway through today and picked up on part of the presentation and you'd like to get the whole thing, you can go to wallbuilderslive.com and download today's entire program and yesterday's program, and you'll be caught up. And then tomorrow we will have the conclusion of the principles of limited government. If you'd like the easy route, go to wallbuilders.com. There's a CD there called The Principles of Limited Government, and you can get the whole presentation all at once. It's so important for us to recognize what limited government really means, and then how do you get it? What are the things you're looking for in your nation and in your government, not only at the federal level, but at state and local level as well. So really appreciate David putting this program together. The conclusion tomorrow with David Barton on the principles of limited government. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green.
We stand undivided.